break. The sun has just come out here over Hull, so that's a good sign. Our second panel today is looking at issues around human rights, the prohibition of slavery, and forced and early marriage. And our first speaker is Chiara Liguori, who is a policy advisor on environment and human rights at Amnesty International. She leads the organization's policy and strategy development on climate change and human rights. And she previously worked as Caribbean researcher at Amnesty and also as a human rights officer for the UN in Haiti and Comoros. She's particularly interested in climate-related migration and displacement, which she recently studied in her master's on refugee protection and forced migration studies at the University of London. And just before she speaks, I'm going to put in the chat a link to the Amnesty report that Chiara is going to talk about today, so you'll be able to access that. And don't forget to add your questions for Chiara and all the other panelists in the comment box, in the chat box as well. Okay, over to you, Chiara.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me well, first of all?
Yes.
Thank you. This is really great to be here. And as Sophia was saying, I'm going to present what Amnesty has been doing mostly through this report that came out in June this year called Stop Burning Our Rights, which is a policy briefing in a way, although very long, that details what states and corporations must do to protect humanity from the climate crisis. And let me share my screen 1 second. Yeah, does it work?
Yes, we can see that, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the report, and it's available in English, but then an executive summary also in French and Spanish, and the full version in French will be available in a couple of months as well. So if you're interested. Today, just a quick recap of what I'm gonna talk about. So nothing really new for this group, I suppose, but just a way of providing the context why climate change is a human rights issue of unprecedented proportions. And on the other hand, how the international human rights standards and framework can be relevant to tackling the climate crisis. And many of you have already touched on these. So again, it's a bit of an introductory approach that hopefully will bring different elements of the conversation today in the same space. So just quickly on climate change as a human rights crisis, we know that the times have gone when people thought that climate change was basically only impacting polar bears. Now we know that it's a major human rights issue because it's created by humans and it's affecting humanity as a whole, and current and present and future generations. And we already current levels of global warming of 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius. We're already seeing serious impacts all over the world. And last summer was just an indication of what we are facing, from flooding in Germany, in China, and heat waves in Pakistan and Canada and many other places, and wildfires in Greece and so on. So this is just an indication. And then I found this data from the Internal Development Monitoring Center quite telling that between 2008 and 2018, heat waves, wildfires, and tropical storms internally displaced almost 21 million people. So, so we know that for every degree of further increase in global temperatures, these impacts will become worse. And I find this map quite useful to just quickly visualize what a world of 4 degrees Celsius global warming would look like. And we can see that what we are facing in the desertification of most parts of the world. And also climate change is a human rights issue because of it's a manifestation of deep-rooted injustices. And the topic of this conference today is really what this is about. So as others have already pointed out, are people who are already facing marginalization and then discrimination who are the most affected by the climate crisis. And this is a result of inequalities, neglect, exclusion, and inequalities also between countries, and mostly related to the impact and long-lasting consequences of colonialism. And so, for example, we see people with disabilities facing heightened difficulties, for example, in the post-disaster context. Some of you already mentioned as well, people living in affected by modern slavery are actually also more exposed to these impacts, and precisely also in the context of aftermath of disasters. Children as well, and indigenous peoples that live that rely on the natural environments for their livelihoods, for their cultural rights and traditions, but also live many times in very vulnerable, climate vulnerable areas because of the tradition of expropriation and evictions. Or similarly, migrants and refugees who might be on the move for climate-related reasons, but not only, so for all sorts of reasons, they actually become particularly affected by climates as well in their journeys. For example, just let's think about people living in camps in Myanmar, Rohingya people in very climate hotspots, and that are facing enormous risks because of the climate crisis. And so, so on the one hand, if it's clear to everybody that climate change is a human rights issue, international human rights do not only help framing this issue in terms of climate as an existential threat for which states and corporations have clear responsibilities, but also they clarify what states and corporations must do. So there are legal obligations to act, and this is the most powerful force of human rights for me, is just it adds to environmental law, which is a bit weaker in many aspects, and there are less sort of universal ratification, like some conventions, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was almost near to universal ratification. So human rights treaties kind of offer a stronger legal framework, because they also come with some tools, the human rights mechanisms that can help providing remedy as well. And so what we've done in this report, Stop Burning Our Rights, is really to detail what the obligation of states are based on human rights law in relation to the climate crisis. And so just going quickly one by one, first of all, states need to urgently phase out greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because all states have the duty to protect the enjoyment of human rights from the climate crisis, and so reduce emission as fast and as justly as possible to actually keep global temperature within 1.5 degrees. And so states must set adequate emission reduction targets that are aligned with these 1.5 targets and implement them. Also, as Jasmine, I think, already pointed out, and others, states must help people to adapt to climate change. So we know that climate change mitigation is important, but there are always impacts that cannot be avoided, and so states need to support people in adapting. And in this adaptation process, they need to ensure that people who are most exposed and marginalized actually are prioritized in these measures, which is generally the exact opposite of what's happening. As people who are most impacted and marginalized are actually also neglected in these responses. And most importantly as well, states must also ensure that climate action upholds human rights. So we cannot accept human rights violations in the name of climate action. And for example, think about renewable energy projects that are built on indigenous lands without the consent of indigenous people, and that then result in a cycle of human rights violations. And so no human rights violation on the one hand, and on the other hand, climate action should actually be the opportunity to promote a just transition and the fulfillment of human rights. So, and these are also points that have been touched on already. And to have a just transition, it's crucial that states guarantee the right to information and participation. So people have the right to be informed about the state of the climate, what measures the state is taking to fight climate change, and most importantly, people who are those who will be more impacted by the decisions related to these. And so this participation and information can actually guarantee that climate measures enjoy wider support and are actually implemented and not contested, like in certain cases we have seen, for example, with the Gilets jaunes protest in France. And also it's crucial that states provide affected people with remedy. So states should ensure that those whose rights have been impacted by climate change, and especially, for example, by states' failure to take all adequate measures, those people need to have access to remedy, for example, in courts or through human rights mechanisms and so on. And these also relate with the issue of loss and damage, because the impacts that have already manifested and will manifest, it needs to be seen as well as a form of the wealthier states need to recognize their responsibility and provide remedy to people most affected by loss and damage, especially in the global south. And remedy includes compensation and so financial resources. And so this connects as well with increasing international cooperation and assistance, which is the duty of all countries with resources to do so, and so particularly for wealthier governments and countries. And so to provide resources to developing countries for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And also important that states must safeguard the rights of people displaced by climate change. So, I mean, as you know, the topic is very broad, but I've summarized it in three key pillars. Like, first of all, they must reduce the likelihood and extent of climate-related displacements. So, by taking those measures we mentioned in terms of climate change mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk reduction. But besides that, there's still going to be people who need to move, and because of climate change, and in that case, either internally or cross-border, those people need to access effective protection. And at the same time, states should also provide safe and regular migration pathways to those who might need to move preventively to avoid forced displacements in the face of, for example, climate, when situations are becoming conditions and life in the country becoming inhabitable and dire, and would lead to human rights violations. And also the importance of states to regulate businesses, because businesses have a very big impact and responsibility for the climate crisis, especially fossil fuel companies and agribusiness and large agribusiness. And so it's important that states set up an adequate regulatory framework, so to ensure that businesses report and account for their emissions and also take adequate measures to reduce them, but also that they respect human rights in their global operations and supply chains, also including when they engage in sort of operations that are related to the energy transition, for example, or climate change mitigation. So even when they're working for what we need, they need to respect human rights in their global operations and so on. And so in a way, I've also told you what the responsibilities of companies are, And so on the one hand, you have the responsibilities of the obligation of states to set up this regulatory framework. On the other hand, you have the responsibility of corporations to implement these measures, regardless of whether the state has set up this regulatory framework. Corporations do have responsibilities based on human rights standards and principles that apply to the climate crisis. And I'm going to stop here and welcome your questions. And stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Chiara. I'm going to use my prerogative as chair to ask the first question, if that's okay. So keep the questions coming in the chat meanwhile. So Amnesty is best known, I think, for its work on issues like the death penalty, ending torture, and freeing prisoners of conscience. So I wondered how you've managed to incorporate climate change into Amnesty's mandate, and whether that's been well received by the supporters and members that Amnesty has around the world.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a long journey, not without bumps. So I think a few of us in the organization started already like 6-7 years ago, but also there were the demands from certain Amnesty national sections, entities, that especially saw the needs to address this issue because their youth groups were demanding it. So this was far before Fridays for Future and so on. So there was already some awareness in Amnesty youth groups, and that was really a leading factor. And on the other hand, it has been some resistance from different parts of the organization because of what you mentioned, of sort of fear of mandate creep, but now it has been completely accepted, and it is an important part of our new strategy framework for 2022-2030. So hopefully, because we do recognize that it's a crucial issue, as I said before, and we need everybody on board, and so human rights organizations also have the responsibility of being active on this topic and provide support to the climate justice movement. And we have different tools to do that, so that can be complementary to what environmental organizations have, like human rights research on case studies, or advocating on the basis of human rights standards and principles, as I said before, or bringing cases to justice through using human rights arguments. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. We received a couple of questions here that both touch on the issue of sort of community consultation and vulnerable groups. So if I could maybe read both questions to you, and then you might want to answer them at the same time. So the first is, how do you propose that the voices of the most vulnerable are heard as they are the most affected? As an example, those who live in the most rural and isolated areas. And then the second question asks, the need to protect the rights of those communities who are routinely excluded in climate change adaptation is critical. And do you have suggestions on how this can be done?
These are very important points, and the way as Amnesty is starting working on this together with other groups, for example, through case studies on impacts of climate change on fisher-folk communities in Bangladesh, especially on the Dalit community. So I think it could be very relevant for this group, or in Madagascar, people affected by the drought, and so on. And so what we are seeing is really that there is, as you say, this lack of participation and involvement. On the other hand, it's crucial that these measures are already kind of, states have really the responsibility to identify what the barriers are to participation, and for example, looking at what prevents certain groups and certain people within certain groups to have their voices heard. And this is the element that is always kind of missing, this sort of an agenda and intersectional analysis on what the barriers are and what needs to be done to address them. So I think that also as a research community, this could be very interesting to bring this up with concrete recommendation in each case by case studies. And sorry, have I answered, or was there another element?
No, I think that's really interesting. Thank you. We've got a few more questions coming in. If I could just put one more to you, which is that understanding slavery from the human rights approach is a challenge for current mainstream approaches from UNODC and other UN agencies regarding trafficking in persons and affects all criminal justice actors. What would you suggest as a way forward for that paradigm from the criminal justice actors?
Probably, I think that this question might be best placed to colleagues that actually do work on anti-slavery all the time. I'm not an anti-slavery person, but I think that I think again the power of stories, of human stories, is generally very valuable, and I'm very grateful in this conference that we've started with this the section today, and so I think sometimes like even agencies that are kind of still hanging on the criminal justice perspective needs to really understand what the complexities are through case studies and hearing the voices directly from people most affected.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. There are some other questions, a couple of other questions in the chat. So if you have the time to respond to those directly. And just a quick reminder then, before we hear from our third speaker on this panel, that we are collecting ideas today on ways that we can collaborate in the future to keep the discussion going, either through a publication or future events or some kind of network. So as well as putting your questions for the panelists in the chat box, could you also please include any ideas that you have for future collaborations, or you can send them to my email address, which I will type in again in a moment. So our third speaker rounding off this panel is Carolina Rudnick Vizcarra, representing Fundación Libera in Chile. Carolina is a lawyer from the University of Concepcion with a master in criminal policy from LSE and Fulbright Fellow from the American University, specializing in human trafficking, corruption, and international human rights law. A member of the Capricorns Network, she's completed postgraduate courses in constitutional law and fundamental rights at Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, studies in moral philosophy at the University of Concepcion, and studies in philosophy of science at IFICC. She served as a lawyer in the Department of Organized Crime in the Ministry of the Interior and Public Security of Chile. And during 2016 to 18, she was in charge of international affairs of the Financial Analysis Unit, from where she led the construction of the second national strategy against money laundering and terrorist financing. She currently chairs the Libera Foundation, a non-profit organization combating human trafficking and contemporary slavery. She works as professor of political and constitutional law at the Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile, and she's consultant for the Inter-American Commission of Women and Eurosocial Plus, and a researcher at the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. So are you there, Carolina? I can't see your video right now. I know I saw you a moment ago. Here you are. I'm going to try and unmute you. There we go.
Thank you.
Over to you, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much, Safia and Christopher, for convening this this gathering, this seminar, and I'm delighted and honored to be here. So I'm gonna share screen. Okay, it looks like you can see it.
Yeah, we can see that. Brilliant.
Perfect. And let me see if I might have to. Please excuse me if I leave it this way. I know it's not as nice as when you put it in the whole screen, but it's just that I need to open two documents. So I just wonder if you can see the slides, or do you see a Word document next to it?
No, I can see the slides there. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's quite clear. That's fine.
Thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is something that I've been researching from quite some time. And it's this connection between slavery and ecocide understood in this primary concepts of freedom and life, and the need of an ontological shift in order to, in my opinion, understand the deepness of the connection between both phenomenons. So in order to be as clear as possible, I'm going to read my presentation. I'm going to show some slides. Don't worry, Safi, I took how much time I was going to take, and it is 15 minutes, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to do it in time. Of course, please feel free to stop me if it's taking me too long. Okay, so the crossroads. What are we facing, right? At the pre-COP, the meeting prior to COP25, which was held in San Jose de Costa Rica in October 2019, to prepare the political discussions that were going to be held in Santiago, Chile in December 2019. In the end, that didn't happen because of many things. Cristiana Figueres, the Costa Rican negotiating leader of the Paris Agreement, said, "We must begin to understand what nature has always done, that nature and humanity are one, intertwined in a network, and that network needs a comprehensive approach." The metaphor is eloquent. The latest research led by experts in modern slavery have shown a link between slavery and climate change. Indeed, research in different parts of the world, including Latin America, show that the new forms of slavery that proliferate in areas without or with little state presence pose a great threat of environmental destruction. Studies show that both phenomena are not only inexorably linked, but mutually reinforcing. Enslaved people are used to destroy the environment. In turn, when an ecosystem is devastated, the people who live there are thrown closer and closer to slavery. The intersection between ecocide and slavery is not accidental. In my opinion, what the figures and results of social scientific research show is that what is behind the destruction of the environment and the social fabric in slavery is the same: an ethical and spiritual crisis which has stimulated the values of competition, individualism, and accumulation over collaboration, reflection, and mutual care. And that by the severity of the disaster puts us at a civilizational crossroad. Well, this ethical and spiritual crisis might be anchored in a misperception. This misperception occurs at the level of beliefs or categories with which a human being classifies and interprets reality. Avant-garde science has shown that the reality that surrounds us, that which we touch, smell it, that it exists, is an interconnected and interdependent network or system pattern. Triggered by the discoveries in physics, biology, and neuroscience in the last 30 years, the new paradigm has displaced the Newtonian model of the universe, understood as a machine of elementary building blocks, to evolve to the notion of system. The material world ultimately is a network of inseparable relationship patterns. The planet as a whole is a self-regulated living system. The vision of the human body as a machine and of the mind as a separate entity is being replaced by one that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, body tissues, and even every cell as a living cognitive system. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as a cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. At the very core of this new understanding of life, we find a profound change of ontological metaphors, from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. As Professor Capra explains, biology is demonstrating a final coherent explanation of living beings as systems, as patterns, as flows. Life develops along the path of networks and communications. Living systems emerge as an expression of the incessant impulse of collaboration, creativity, and creation of novelty in nature. Nature and living beings show a capacity for altruism, collaboration, and diversity. We living beings have structures that determine the way in which we will relate and join structurally with the environment, but these structures do not condition but qualify our access to the network and its understanding. Physics is unraveling that time is a property of the mind, that reality is uncertainty, that existence is nothing but a tendency to exist, and that light, which we are at some level of the electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to the eyes, exists as particles and waves. At the very core, it's the next. Quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and particle experiments have taught us that the world is a continuous and restless swarm of things, a continuous exit to light and the disappearance of ephemeral entities, a set of vibrations, as in the hippie world of the 60s, a world of events, not things. These scientific discoveries imply a paradigm shift at the level of the scientific revolutions described by Kuhn. The new metaphor of reality as a network emphasizes that reality is a certain pattern of links of relationships. The change in metaphors illuminates the change in consciousness the current crossroads is demanding, and identifies a map that can guide us into the labyrinth. To understand the new systemic paradigm, one must understand how nature, the system that we create and creates us, sustains life. In a nutshell, nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. No individual organism can exist in isolation. As soon as the first cells appear on Earth, they form closely interconnected communities known as bacterial colonies, and for billions of years, nature has maintained such communities at all levels of life. Throughout the long history of evolution, nature has sustained life by creating and nurturing communities. Natural selection favors those communities in which individuals act for the benefit of the community as a whole. The new systemic paradigm shows us that what is sustained in a sustainable community is not economic growth or competitive advantage, but the whole network of life in which our long-term survival depends. The dimension of the consequences of the new scientific paradigm cannot be fully grasped unless we understand how humans learn, live in language, and give meaning to their experiences. We do that through the use of metaphors. Human beings are cognitive beings that learn to live in language through experiential metaphors that emerge in our encounters with the environment. Experiential cognitivism, part of the scientific discoveries that underpin the new paradigm developed by Lakoff and Johnson, argues that metaphors are a central conceptual construction for the development of thought. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we think and act, is fundamentally metaphoric in nature. Metaphor is for most people a device of the poetic imagination and the rhetorical flourish, a matter of extraordinary rather than ordinary language. Moreover, metaphor is typically viewed as a characteristic of language alone, a matter of words rather than thought or action. For this reason, most people think that they can get along perfectly well without metaphors. We have found, on the contrary, that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Non-metaphorical thinking is only possible for lack of when we talk about pure physical reality. For lack of, the higher the level of abstraction, the more layers of metaphor are needed to express it. People do not notice these metaphors for several reasons. One reason is that some metaphors become dead and we no longer recognize their origin. Another reason is that we simply do not see what is happening. Lakoff states that the mind is embodied. Almost all human cognition, even the most abstract reasoning, depends and makes use of concrete and low-level facilities such as the sensory motor system and the emotions. Therefore, the embodied mind is a rejection not only of dualism vis-a-vis the mind and matter, but also of the claims that human reason can be understood basically without reference to its physical body and emotional system. According to Lakoff, the metaphor seems to be a new neuronal mechanism that allows us to adapt the neural systems using sensory motor activity to create forms of abstract reasoning. If this is correct, as it seems to be, he says, our sensory motor systems limit the abstract reasoning we can perform. Anything we can think of, or we can think or understood is shaped, is possible, and is limited by our bodies, brains, and our interactions embodied in the world. So just to give you a crucial example of how humans operate through metaphors, and how behind our daily metaphors we can find this primary grounding metaphors that arise from our physical experience with reality, is what we can see with this grounding metaphors of up is good and down is bad. So you can see in common language, for example, phrases that say something like, I'm gonna rise to the top of my career, I'm gonna climb the ladder of my company, I'm in the hole of the depression. And of course, no one looks to the person who says those phrases as if he's crazy. We all understand those phrases because those phrases are metaphors that in the end relate to this primal metaphor where we comprehend that up is good and down is bad. And why up is good and down is bad? Because if we go to the original experience of the person of the primitive man or woman, up was the sun, the light, and down was the abyss, the hole where I could fall, you know, and find no help and ultimately die. Another example of how we work in we think and act as in metaphors has to do with this little photographs. These are nails, right, and stones, but we can see here a mother and a child, and we can see here somebody helping somebody in disgrace or with depression, and we definitely can see here someone in a situation of slavery. And we can understand all these pictures because we understand the world through metaphors. And the challenge is to see what are the grounding metaphors that are behind the comprehension of slavery, of our relationship with other human beings, of our relationship with the world. If metaphor is the engine of thought, it is possible to trace the effect the mechanistic paradigm has had on the way we perceive the world and our role in it. The metaphor of irreducible separation between minds or between minds individuals encouraged in philosophy, law, and politics, has encouraged in philosophy, law, and politics a vision of man as a wolf to man, and reaffirmed the belief in war as the basic inclination of human nature. It seems that it is in this metaphor where the misperception about reality and humanness lies. The misperception is due to the interference of two assumptions or related beliefs that we can trace to the mechanistic paradigm. We are fundamentally separate and alone beings, isolated, discrete entities, and consequently, the accumulation of resources is the ultimate means of survival, authorizing selfishness, understood as a concern for one's own welfare or advantage at the expense of or in disregard of others, as the criterion of preference in the exercise of my freedom, my power to decide and act. Sorry, that is absence of consciousness of unity. This perception of reality triggers fear and subsequently discrimination as the automatic psycho-emotional response to beings that I consider alien to my circle of peers or community of belonging. And it is embedded and extended in time and space, in law, politics, and culture globally. In other words, the structural cognitive paradigm or primary metaphor of separation, otherness, and war is what is behind environmental destruction and slavery, understood as structural denial of commutative justice in the redistribution of global wealth, as well as in generalized violence, hunger, ignorance, individualism, competitiveness, and social distrust. The interconnected and interdependent network of nature shows us that its pattern obeys a preference for decisions that create and sustain life. A sustainable community is designed in such a way that their ways of life, business, economy, physical structures, and technologies respect, honor, and cooperate with nature's inherent capacity to sustain life. We are at a great crossroads. The global system has proven not to be sustainable. It has not been able to create or nurture communities. The current situation is unsustainable and irrational, as it produces a disturbance in an interconnected environment that carries the risk of destroying the entire system, including the subsystems that wanted to survive at the expense of the rest. The belief in perpetual economic growth at all costs amounts to a clash between linear thinking and non-linear patterns in our biosphere, the networks and ecological cycles that constitute the web of life. I'm almost done, by the way. I love this quote. Everything that needs to be said has already been said, but since no one was listening, everything must be said again. The value of creating and nurturing life present in nature is a possible map of our ethical and spiritual action. This has been said before. We can trace in the history of mankind the transmission of a message that has passed from generation to generation. The worldviews and spirituality of indigenous people, as well as all ancestral spiritual traditions, have declared unity as the basic structure of the universe. The metaphors of the mythical stories speak of universal source, consciousness, belonging, vibration, spirit, and transcendental unity. The ultimate primary metaphor is the universe seen, understood, and felt as the sacred chalice of life, the universal mother, the sacred feminine. It is no accident that indigenous people are the staunchest defenders of natural ecosystems and at the same time one of the communities most vulnerable to modern slavery. They have transmitted a wisdom that through history, stories and legends captures an understanding that science is revealing. The consciousness of interconnection and interdependence with the system as a whole, and a human anthropology composed of rational, emotional, and bodily dimensions, and spontaneously motivated by curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. Human at a given historical moment took a course that prioritized domination and hierarchical relationships between individuals over collaboration and co-creation as basic human beliefs. Basically, the consciousness of unity, which refers to a state of mental and moral evolution where I realize that I am part of something that constitutes me and that I constitute at the same time, was weakened, lost, erased. And so just to finish, let me show this final, oh, I don't know where it go, sorry. So just to finish my presentation, what this separation, this belief of separation and the denial of the interconnectedness of reality, the interconnectedness between every one of us, basically has authorized and has allowed us to believe that that separation and competitiveness is basically our nature, and that is how we can find, comments like this in social media, where you see humans saying one can never cooperate with someone one can costlessly overrun. But the thing is that if we trace the primary original metaphors of the way we understand the world, and we look at these ancient traditions, and we look at this grounding metaphor of the universe as this universal mother, what we can see is that the basic ontological relationship that orders natural world and also human world is the basic ontological relationship of the archetype of the mother and the archetype of the child. And the basic relationships between these two archetypes is, on the one hand, the care and nourishing, and on the other hand, the impulse of creation and exchange with others. And I truly believe that there was a moment in human history where we all shared this common belief of coming from a common source and leading to this common source. And just to finish, I just want to share with you the magnificent oldest figure of human form that archaeology has ever found, that is between 35,000 to 40,000 years ago, which is the figure of this female figure. As all businesses of primitive times, all the features of motherhood and human and female sexuality are highlighted, giving us this indiciary pattern of how humans understood their role in the world and their comprehension of the universe as this interconnected womb, from where we all come and to where we all go. So, in a nutshell, the challenge here basically is the change of the perspective of how we see the world, and the challenge of the primary metaphors that are in our comprehension of the world. As the understanding of the world comes from our physical experience, if we don't experience justice, we will not be able to imagine that could take place in the world. And therefore, in my opinion, the challenges have to do with fostering a change in this primary metaphors that are sustained and supported by contemporary science, and disseminate this knowledge to open our minds to the understanding of new possibilities of human collaboration and partnership. I think I took more time, so sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Carolina. You've certainly provided us all with a completely fresh perspective, I think, on the existential questions of who we are and how we relate to our environment and to each other. And I feel like you're a true Renaissance woman, given the huge range of experiences and expertise that you have and that you've brought to us today. So thank you very much. We're going to break for lunch shortly, but I think there's time just for one question here. We had a really interesting question. Well, we had a lot of questions actually from your talk, but a really interesting one I think here from Tanya, which is, can we use oral tradition to shape and reshape the way we discuss systems affected by climate change, and to build resilience by talking about climate action in new ways? So a question there about oral tradition.
Definitely, absolutely, and actually you can trace this primary metaphors in oral tradition, and it's usually the way how indigenous communities have been able to transfer the knowledge along generations. So it's definitely a fantastic mechanism, and also it relates to storytelling, and storytelling is also another great mechanism to bring new understandings of reality, because it also bring this instrument of empathy, right? Storytelling allows me to imagine, and the use of imagination opens to moral imagination and put myself in other people's shoes, and therefore be able to feel what someone else feels, and ultimately trigger consciousness and action.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, and to all of our panelists in this session. It's been really eye-opening, really exciting.